The Royal Hotel in Flaxborough was not, as its name bravely suggested, in any way royal. Its paintwork was touched up just often enough to avoid complaint from the borough council. Its carpets bore the lumpy imprints of generations of portly travelling salesmen, and its reception bell rang in a manner more reproachful than welcoming. Yet to the town's more prosperous citizens, it remained the place to take luncheon when one wished to be seen eating somewhere more impressive than home. It was therefore unfortunate that on the Tuesday in question the hotel found itself the scene of a minor but oddly compelling drama. Mrs. Ada Shuttleworth, president of the Flaxborough Floral Society, had just concluded her remarks at a committee luncheon when the commotion began. She had been reminding those assembled of the importance of modesty in arrangements, a lesson cruelly forgotten, I am sorry to say, by last year's winning chrysanthemum, when a loud voice from the landing above interrupted her. "Room 17! I told you 17!" The voice, male, middle-aged, and not belonging to anyone in the luncheon party, carried with surprising vigour down the narrow stairwell. What followed was a crash of wood upon plaster, then the unmistakable sound of a door being flung open with more force than any lock could have approved of. The luncheon guests, mostly women whose hats were designed to suggest social purpose rather than style, exchanged uneasy glances. Mrs. Shuttleworth herself pursed her lips into a figure of judicial severity. From the stairs came hurried footsteps. A waiter appeared, pale and visibly torn between discretion and curiosity. He leaned toward the manager, who had already risen from his chair at the far end of the room. Words were exchanged, inaudible to the rest, but sufficient to spread through the luncheon party a ripple of speculation more nourishing than any dessert. Within minutes, the story had taken root. Someone, no one knew who exactly, though the names of 2 visiting Scots gentlemen were quickly circulated, had forced entry into room 17, finding it, according to rumour, in a state of disorder. What constituted disorder was subject to interpretation. Mrs. Shuttleworth, recalling her brief glimpse up the stairwell, declared she had seen a suitcase lying open on the floor, its contents scattered as though by some desperate hand. Miss Emily Thistlethwaite, a spinster whose skill lay in embroidery and embellishment alike, announced that she was sure she had heard the word theft spoken, though by whom she could not afterwards say. By the time Inspector Pubright was discreetly summoned from the police station, where he had been engaged in the slow but absorbing process of signing requisition forms for typewriter ribbons, the incident had acquired in popular telling the dimensions of a scandal. Pubright arrived at the Royal in his usual manner, quietly, without haste, and giving the impression of a man for whom even mystery was but another form of paperwork. He greeted the manager, Mr. Leaper, with a courteous nod, and was led upstairs to room 17. The door bore splintered evidence of its recent mistreatment. Inside, however, all appeared curiously ordinary. The bed was neatly made, the curtains half drawn, and the only sign of human occupation, a brown leather suitcase standing open upon the dressing table. Its contents, shirts, socks, and a folded newspaper from Edinburgh, were, if scattered, so with the sort of casualness typical of any traveller. "What exactly was reported to you?" Pubright asked the manager, whose florid complexion had deepened under the strain of suppressed alarm. "Sir," said Mr. Leaper with grave emphasis, "the room is reserved for a Mr. McClintock, a commercial traveller, in hosiery. He went out this morning after breakfast, leaving the key with reception. Shortly after noon, a stranger presented himself, insisting he must gain entry. He spoke with what I can only describe as an accent of the north. He said he was McClintock's associate. Naturally, our staff refused. Next thing we know—" He gestured toward the fractured door. "Did anyone see him leave?" Pubright inquired. "A waiter, sir, but the gentleman was quick. He departed by the side door, taking nothing with him so far as can be told." Pubright nodded slowly, his eyes travelling across the suitcase, the newspaper, and finally to the small writing desk by the window. A postcard lay upon it, half written in a hurried hand. He bent to read the first line. "Arrived safely, will write again when settled." He straightened, remarking mildly, "Not perhaps a burglary in the traditional sense?" "No, Inspector?" "No," Pubright said, though one can hardly blame the luncheon party for thinking so. They were in need of something to sweeten the pudding. The manager, uncertain whether humour was intended, attempted a smile. Pubright, however, was looking thoughtfully once more at the postcard. His gaze lingered on the ink, still faintly glossy in the light. He made no comment, but his expression suggested the first ripple of quiet curiosity in waters otherwise calm. By the time Inspector Pubright returned from the Royal Hotel to his office in the police station, the disturbance in room 17 had already taken on a life of its own in Flaxborough. The town's grapevine, which had long perfected the art of turning half-heard words into scandal, was working with unusual efficiency. At Thorpe's bakery, Mrs. Thorpe assured a customer that a foreign gentleman had been caught in the very act of rifling through another man's belongings. The customer, Mrs. Crowther, who had herself once been caught stealing a spoon from the Civic Hall buffet and therefore considered herself knowledgeable on such matters, shook her head in sombre agreement. By the time Mrs. Crowther reached the greengrocer's, the story had improved. Now the interloper had not only rifled, but also absconded with jewels. Whether rings, necklaces, or a tiara, nobody could say, though a tiara was strongly suspected, as it was just the sort of thing a Royal Hotel guest might keep about. Meanwhile, at the offices of the Flaxborough Citizen, a junior reporter was already composing a tentative headline, "Burglar in broad daylight, town's hotel targeted." The editor, who had seen better scandals, instructed him to replace burglar with intruder, which he judged less likely to invite libel, and then wondered aloud whether the incident might be connected with those Scots who come down here for the races. The police station switchboard, too, was not idle. Constable Love reported that 3 callers had already offered helpful information, including a retired solicitor who had once known a man very much like the description, and an elderly lady who had seen a suspicious face at her window in 1937. In the snug of the King's Arms, the conversation was livelier still. Mr. Hopgood, whose occupation was of no obvious description but whose opinions were always forceful, declared that the fellow had probably been a spy. "There's always something foreign about hosiery," he said darkly, to a general nodding of heads. In another corner of the same establishment, however, Mr. Cattermole, the town clerk, was reassuring his drinking companion that the matter was likely no more than a lover's quarrel. "Always the same with travelling salesmen," he confided. "They leave their morals in the suitcase and their common sense at the station." Through all this, Pubright himself said very little. He sat in his office, listening with mild patience to the reports trickling in from his constables. His questions, when they came, were polite and brief. What time exactly had the stranger entered? Who had first raised the alarm? Was anything, in fact, missing from the room? The answers, though plentiful, were less than precise. The waiter who had witnessed the man's departure was uncertain of his height, his coat colour, and whether or not he had carried a parcel. He was quite firm, however, that the stranger had been cross. Another member of staff described him as polite. What was beyond dispute was that Mr. McClintock, the hosiery traveller, had yet to return to the hotel. Until he did, no one could say for certain whether his belongings had been tampered with, or whether the incident amounted to more than an untidy argument with a door. Still, as dusk fell and the lamps of Flaxborough glowed across the market square, the town remained animated. Housewives whispered in doorways, councillors murmured in the corridors of the Guildhall, and by bedtime the incident in room 17 had grown in importance from a minor disturbance to a matter that, as Mrs. Shuttleworth gravely told her maid, may quite well be a case for Scotland Yard. In the DT police station, Inspector Pubright closed his file for the evening. He had made few notes, merely a record of the suitcase, the half-written postcard, and the unusually hurried manner in which its ink had dried. His expression gave nothing away, but in the stillness of his office he allowed himself the faintest smile, for, unlike the townsfolk, he was less interested in the intruder's noisy entrance than in the quiet fact of what he appeared to have left behind. The next morning broke damp and grey, the sort of weather Flaxborough did best, drizzle that seemed never quite to fall yet never quite to lift. It was into this atmosphere of mild inconvenience that Inspector Pubright began the first of his inquiries into the matter of room 17. He began, sensibly enough, with the hotel's staff. Mr. Leaper, the manager, had fortified himself with a particularly stiff moustache wax for the occasion, as though bristling hair would compensate for the cracks in his authority. He greeted Pubright in the Royal's breakfast lounge with an air of reluctant cooperation. "I wish to assure you, Inspector," he said, "that this establishment has never before been the scene of anything remotely resembling burglary." Pubright inclined his head gravely. "Indeed, a proud record, I'm sure. Tell me, was anything actually reported missing from Mr. McClintock's room?" Leaper hesitated, then admitted, "Not at present. We are still awaiting his return. A very regular gentleman, Scots, as I said, keeps accounts in columns straighter than the Tower of Pisa." The inspector allowed this image to rest a moment before observing, "And yet he leaves his door to be splintered by strangers. Curious." From Leper, Pubright passed to the waiter who had witnessed the intruder's departure. Young Barnes was earnest but nervous, his testimony as cluttered with apologies. "He was hurrying, sir, but not like he'd stolen anything. More like he was, well, cross, if you'll forgive the word." "Cross is permitted," Pubright said mildly. "Anything particular in his manner?" He kept muttering something about a mistake. 17, he said, over and over, like it was important. Pubright thanked him, then lingered a while at the writing desk of room 17. He studied again the postcard, noting how the ink at the beginning had dried smoothly, but the last words showed faint smudges, as if written in haste or with a hand disturbed. He pocketed this observation without comment. Later that morning he paid a call to Mrs. Shuttleworth, whose luncheon party had first supplied Flaxborough with its fresh scandal. She received him in her drawing-room, where chrysanthemums, still objects of controversy, stood stiffly in vases. "The fellow burst in like a madman, Inspector," she declared. "I have no doubt it was burglary. I distinctly saw an open case on the floor." "A suitcase?" Pubright asked politely. "A case, certainly. What it contained I could not possibly say, but I assure you it was open." Miss Emily Thistlethwaite, summoned from next door at the inspector's request, contradicted her at once. "Closed, Inspector, quite definitely shut. My eyesight is impeccable, and I am certain." The two ladies exchanged looks heavy with long-standing disapproval, each satisfied to regard the other as an unreliable witness. Pubright thanked them both equally, then made his way back to the station. By then, word had arrived. Mr. Angus McClintock, commercial traveller in hosiery, had returned to Flaxborough on the late train and was now installed at the Royal once more. It was evening when Pubright finally sat across from him in the subdued atmosphere of the hotel lounge. McClintock was a thick-set man with a booming voice that seemed to prefer echoing off walls. He was not amused. "They tell me some fool's broken into my room. Well, let me tell you, Inspector, if he thought to get away with my stock book, he's sorely mistaken. I carry that on my person at all times. Trust no one, that's my motto." Quite wise, Pubright murmured, and yet the intruder took nothing, it seems. Do you know anyone who might have wished to, visit you unexpectedly? McClintock snorted. Half the hosiery trade of Edinburgh wishes me ill, but few of them would come battering down hotel doors in Lincolnshire. As Pubright prepared to take his leave, McClintock added, almost as an afterthought, "Funny thing, though. My postcard, I'd half written one to my sister in Leith. Can't find it now, must have dropped it." Pubright paused. His expression was mild as ever, but his eyes seemed quietly attentive. "Indeed, Mr. McClintock? Well, no doubt it will turn up." When he left the Royal, the drizzle had thickened into rain. Pubright walked back to the station, his hat pulled low, his thoughts characteristically unreadable, but in his pocket notebook he had written just 3 words: postcard, ink, 17. By Thursday morning, the citizens of Flaxborough had decided amongst themselves that a culprit had already been identified. This was no accident of deduction, but rather the natural tendency of the town to prefer certainty over truth. The candidate was obvious: the stranger who had forced his way into room 17. At the Borough Council offices, the matter was discussed with the solemnity of an international crisis. Councillor Crispin Allgood, whose moustache twitched in times of moral outrage, declared that the police ought to have apprehended the man on the spot. "No question of doubt, Inspector," he insisted, when Pubright was invited, more accurately, summoned, to give his account. A door broken, a suitcase interfered with, a foreigner on the premises. What more evidence could be required? Pubright, seated at the far end of the long mahogany table, listened with his customary air of patient neutrality. "Evidence," he said quietly. "Does rather require detail. At present we have only speculation." Councillor Allgood harumphed. "Speculation? We have half the town swearing to it." "Half the town," Pubright replied with a faint smile, "was not on the landing outside room 17. What they swear to, I think, is the more exciting version." There was a murmur of dissatisfaction around the table. Councillor Harbottle, whose appetite for drama exceeded his digestion, leaned forward and added, "The fellow was clearly a confidence man. We have read of such things in the news of the world. If you do not act, Inspector, the town's reputation will suffer." Pubright allowed this to settle before rising. "Your concern for Flaxborough's reputation is, as ever, touching. I will continue my inquiries." He bowed his head slightly, then excused himself, leaving the councillors to exchange mutters about official complacency. Back at the station, Constable Love was eager to present what he called a lead. A man had been seen boarding the afternoon bus to Grantchester, tall, dark-coated, with a northern accent. Love was certain this must be the intruder. "And what," Pubright asked gently, "did he do to betray his criminality, other than exist?" Love flushed, shuffled his notes, and muttered something about shifty eyes. In the evening, Pubright returned once more to the Royal. There he found Mr. McClintock holding forth in the lounge to an audience of 2 commercial travellers and a retired bank manager. "Brazen as brass," McClintock boomed when he saw Pubright. "The man breaks into my room, finds nothing worth taking, because I'm too canny for thieves and bolts. An obvious scoundrel." The inspector let him speak until the echo of his indignation had worn itself down. Then he asked, lightly, "And yet, Mr. McClintock, you say the only thing missing was a postcard?" McClintock waved a hand. "Worthless. I'd half written it to my sister, only a line or 2. Whoever took it is welcome to the price of a stamp. A curious thing to steal, though, is it not?" The hosiery man shrugged. "Perhaps the rascal wanted it for the picture. A bridge in Edinburgh it was. Not a good likeness either." Pubright thanked him politely and withdrew. To the casual listener, his questions might have seemed no more than routine. But in his mind, the faint line of inquiry that had begun with a half-written card now drew itself a little darker. The townsfolk might content themselves with the simple notion of a clumsy burglar, but Pubright had already marked a discrepancy. The intruder had broken in noisily, yet taken nothing of value, except, it seemed, one small and hasty message. That night, as the rain eased and the town fell to sleep, Pubright wrote in his notebook a single entry underlined twice. Who wanted the postcard? On Friday morning, the drizzle had thinned into a mist that blurred the shop fronts of Flaxborough and lent the town an appearance of reticence, as though it, too, wished to conceal its secrets. Inspector Pubright, however, was not a man distracted by atmospherics. His attention, that day, was upon the oddity of a postcard. At first glance, the loss of so small and valueless an article seemed beneath police interest. A case containing shirts and socks was untouched, a wallet still lay in the bedside drawer, and a silver watch gleamed innocently upon the mantelpiece. Yet the missing postcard clung to Purbright's thoughts with the persistence of a burr. He paid another call upon the Royal. This time he examined the writing desk in room 17 more carefully. The blotter bore faint impressions of words which he tilted towards the light. With patient eyes he could just make out "arrive safely" and "Leith." The rest was smudged into meaningless curls as though erased by an impatient hand. He closed the blotter quietly and stood a long while at the window, looking down upon the cobbled street where townsfolk went about their errands. His face betrayed no urgency, only that mild expression of one who listens for a tune half heard. Later that morning, in the station, Pubright called Constable Love into his office. "Love," he said, "you were taught at school the purpose of a postcard." Love frowned. "To tell somebody you're on holiday, sir." "That is the modern interpretation," Pubright replied with a trace of amusement. "But consider its limitations. It conveys a message openly for all to read, including postmen, clerks, or indeed strangers. If one wished to convey something discreetly, one would not choose a postcard." Love looked puzzled. "So why steal one?" "Why indeed?" murmured Pubright. The same question seemed to echo elsewhere. In the snug of the King's Arms, Mr. Hopgood was insisting the missing postcard was proof of espionage. "Mark my words, gentlemen, they use invisible ink. You dip it in vinegar, and the whole thing appears." Mr. Cattermole, more inclined to the romantic than the criminal, suggested the postcard must have borne a love message, perhaps one indiscreet enough to warrant theft. "I myself once sent a note to a young lady upon the back of a seaside donkey photograph," he confided. "It was intercepted by her father. The consequences were not agreeable." Back at the Royal, the chambermaid added her own embroidery to the tale when Pubright gently questioned her. She was quite certain the postcard had not been there the previous afternoon when she had dusted the writing desk, though she could not swear to its presence before the incident. But she did recall something else, a faint smell of tobacco in the room, sharper than Mr. McClintock's usual pipe. This, too, Pubright noted without comment. By evening, the inspector's notebook contained little more than fragments, postcard, hastily written, Leith, tobacco, not his own. To a less patient mind, it might have seemed no more than a puzzle too small to warrant solution. But Pubright knew Flaxborough well. In this town, trivialities had a habit of sprouting roots in unexpected soil. When he closed his office for the night, he paused by the door, gazing out across the market square where lamplight glimmered in puddles. The townsfolk might talk of burglars, spies, or lovers' quarrels. But for Pubright, the missing postcard was no accident of litter. It was a thread, slender, almost invisible, yet one which, if tugged carefully, might unravel an entire skein of concealment. And so, with that quiet certainty known only to him, he wrote at the bottom of the day's notes, "Begin with the trivial, the rest will follow." By Saturday morning, the gossip over room 17 had ripened into a sort of civic entertainment. The town was divided into two distinct schools, those who regarded the incident as a simple case of burglary bungled, and those who considered it the outer ripple of some greater intrigue. In both camps, however, certainty was abundant. Inspector Pubright, meanwhile, expanded his quiet net of inquiries. He began not with the town's officials, who would merely repeat their demands for swift justice, but with its more ordinary citizens, the ones whose lives brushed lightly against the Royal Hotel and its temporary guests. The first was Mr. Finch, the postmaster, who had known McClintock by sight for several years. "Very regular fellow," Finch remarked, polishing his spectacles while Pubright listened. "Never writes much. One or two postcards, perhaps, to his sister in Scotland. Always chooses the cheapest stamp. Nothing suspicious about him. But—" He paused, clearly relishing the moment. "There was a letter sent from here last month addressed to a Miss R. at an Edinburgh lodging house. Bold handwriting, I remember it. And McClintock posted it himself." "Miss R.," Pubright repeated mildly. "And no full name?" "None, Inspector. Just the initial." Finch smiled faintly. Not quite the style of communication one sends to a sister. Pubright made a note, thanked him, and strolled on. His next stop was at the tobacconist's shop. Here, Mrs. Diggle, who prided herself on her memory for customers' habits, confirmed that Mr. McClintock purchased only a mild shag tobacco for his pipe. The sharper odour described by the chambermaid must have belonged to another. "We do have a gentleman who favours Balkan blend," she added with relish. "Strong as tar, if you ask me. Calls every few weeks when in town. Tall chap, sharp accent. A Scot, I believe." By the time Pubright returned to the station, the portrait of the stranger had thickened, a man who shared McClintock's accent, who smoked a more pungent leaf, and who had made some show of urgency about room 17. Yet motive remained elusive. That afternoon another voice was added to the chorus. Mrs. Hopkin, the landlady of a modest boarding house, presented herself at the station, fluttering with the nervous righteousness of one bearing information. She insisted she had let a room, briefly, to a northerner. He had left suddenly, without proper notice, the very day before the Royal Hotel disturbance. She could offer no name, but she recalled his habit of pacing the floor in the evenings, and his curious request that she forward any letters addressed to J.R. Pubright, thanked her with grave courtesy, while Love scribbled eagerly into his notebook. By evening, the inspector's files contained the beginnings of a wider web: a Scots traveller, another Scotsman with habits of secrecy, a postcard unfinished, and a mysterious Miss R. in Edinburgh. It was no longer merely a question of a door forced open in Flaxborough, but of correspondences and connections that stretched northward across the border. Yet Purbright's manner remained as ever unruffled. He treated his constables to a quiet tea, in which the only remark of consequence he made was, "You will have noticed, Love, that a postcard does not weigh much, yet someone thought it worth the risk of splintering a door. Weight in these matters is not measured in ounces, but in meanings." Love looked suitably perplexed. When Pubright returned home that night, the town was still buzzing with speculation. He walked past shop windows where clerks whispered, past parlours glowing with evening gossip, and past the hotel itself, whose cracked door still bore mute testimony. To Flaxborough, the incident had widened into entertainment. To Pubright, it had widened into something else. A reminder that beneath the neat routines of small-town life there ran currents of passion, secrecy, and grievance that even a postcard might betray. Sunday in Flaxborough was ordinarily a day devoted to church, modest roast dinners, and the perusal of newspapers a day behind London. It was therefore most inconvenient to the rhythm of the town when a second disturbance arrived to unsettle its quiet equilibrium. Shortly after morning service, word spread that something had happened again at the Royal Hotel. This time there was no mistaking the seriousness. A guest had been found missing. The chambermaid, making her usual rounds, had knocked upon room 19, 2 doors along from McClintock's 17, and, receiving no answer, had let herself in with the master key. The bed had been slept in, the wash-basin used, but the guest, a Mr. James Robertson of Glasgow, at least according to the register, was gone. More curious still, his suitcase remained, packed neatly with shirts, collar studs, and 2 unopened tins of pipe tobacco. On the writing table was a single envelope, sealed but unaddressed. By the time Inspector Pubright arrived, the hotel was in a state of hushed agitation. Guests clustered in doorways, staff hovered on stairwells, and Mr. Leaper's moustache had developed a tremor, suggesting outright mutiny of the upper lip. Pubright examined the room with his usual lack of ceremony. He noted the untouched suitcase, the tins of pungent Balkan tobacco, and the envelope upon the desk. With gloved fingers he lifted it, weighing it briefly before tucking it into his pocket. "No signs of departure?" he asked the manager. "None, Inspector. The side door shows no use. The front desk received no key. The man has simply vanished." "Suitcase and all?" Leaper blinked. "No, sir. The suitcase is here. Clothes, belongings, everything but the gentleman himself." Pubright nodded. "A very light traveller, it seems." The discovery of Robertson's disappearance, combined with the earlier intrusion into McClintock's room, was enough to whip Flaxborough into a new frenzy of speculation. By midday the King's Arms was echoing with talk of abduction. Mr. Hopgood was convinced the stranger had been spirited away by a foreign power. Mr. Cattermole preferred to believe in a romantic elopement, noting that a man seldom leaves his shirts behind unless a woman has persuaded him to. At the police station, Pubright studied the envelope. It contained a single folded sheet on which was written, in a hurried hand, "Tell her the bridge is safe. J.R." He read it twice, then placed it carefully back. There was no address, no indication of the intended recipient, but the handwriting, firm, Scottish, unmistakable, bore a resemblance to the impression he had seen in the blotter of room 17. That afternoon, Pubright called once more upon McClintock. The hosiery man was indignant. "Robertson, never heard of him. But I'll tell you this, Inspector, the trade is full of rogues. Some will stop at nothing to snatch a contract. Bridge is safe. Bah! I wouldn't trust half of them to cross one." Pubright, untroubled by the bluster, merely asked, "Would you say Mr. Robertson resembled our mysterious intruder?" McClintock hesitated, then scowled. "Could be. I didn't see him close enough, but he had the look of a Scot, certainly, the kind that gives us decent men a bad name." By evening the gossip had turned Robertson into a spy, a debtor fleeing his creditors, and the illegitimate son of a Highland laird, all within the space of 3 conversations. The town relished this second incident with even more appetite than the first. Pubright, however, kept his focus on the paper in his pocket. 2 fragments now lay before him, a half-written postcard to Leith and a hurried note signed J.R., speaking of a bridge. Coincidence perhaps, but in Flaxborough, coincidences had a way of being less accidental than they appeared. In his notebook that night he wrote only, "Second incident confirms first. Question not who, but what message? Bridge?" And then, with his usual unhurried calm, he closed the book and went home to his supper. Inspector Pubright was a man of even habits. Each evening he walked from the police station to his modest house in Northgate Street, where Mrs. Pubright, who, the town suspected existed chiefly in the inspector's imagination would have been, had she existed at all, waiting with slippers and stew. In reality, Pubright prepared his own supper, plain dishes, competently executed, and ate in the quiet company of his own thoughts. That Sunday evening, after the mystery of Mr. Robertson's disappearance, his thoughts required rather more chewing than the beef. The note, "Tell her the bridge is safe," preoccupied him, not because of its urgency. Messages of that kind often turned out to mean less than they appeared. Rather, it was its connection to the blotter mark in McClintock's room that troubled him. Here were two men, strangers in theory, both leaving evidence of correspondence northwards, both with ties, direct or indirect, to Scotland. Pubright had spent enough years in Flaxborough to know that commercial travellers, while industrious in their way, frequently conducted a parallel life of subterfuge. Their bags of samples and catalogues were the camouflage of intrigues personal, political, or sometimes merely amorous. Hotels, after all, were neutral ground, anonymous foyers, shared dining tables, a brisk turnover of occupants, conditions that lent themselves to transactions of every sort, both legitimate and otherwise. Seated at his table, Pubright allowed himself a small smile. Flaxborough prided itself on being insulated from the world's currents. Yet here was evidence that the town's calm facade was merely the surface of a pond upon which occasionally a pebble dropped from a very great distance indeed. The inspector's reflection was interrupted by the clock striking 10. He had an early morning planned, discreet inquiries at the station regarding Robertson's railway ticket. If the man had truly arrived from Glasgow, there would be a record. If not, then Robertson was as much a fiction as the bridge in his note. Pubright rinsed his dishes, dried them with a cloth that had seen brighter days, and carried his notebook to the armchair. He jotted with his neat hand, 2 visitors, connection probable. McClintock agitated, evasive. Robertson vanished, suitcase left. Message, bridge is safe, could refer to meeting point or code. Bridge, literal or metaphorical. He closed the notebook, leaned back, and regarded the ceiling with the mild, owl-like solemnity that was his habit when turning over difficult notions. The trouble with secrets, he mused, was not their existence but their tendency to multiply. One lie required another, one note, another reply, one disappearance, a further explanation. By degrees, an entire fabric was woven, and fabric, sooner or later, frayed. He was reminded faintly of a case years before, an affair involving a draper, 2 missing rolls of serge, and a love letter to a woman who insisted upon payment in bolts of cloth rather than coin. That case had unravelled not because of the theft, but because the lady had insisted the serge be made into curtains. Curtains, unlike cash, must hang in windows. Secrets, like fabric, longed to be displayed. At 10:30, Pubright rose, adjusted the window latch, and extinguished the lamp. He went to bed with the calm conviction that whatever business was playing itself out between rooms 17 and 19 would eventually declare itself. Flaxborough might appear somnolent, but it was the nature of small towns that very little remained hidden for long. Someone, perhaps Leaper with his twitching moustache, perhaps a chambermaid with too sharp an eye, would let slip a detail. And that detail, trivial in itself, would open the door to everything else. As he drifted towards sleep, Pubright entertained the faint hope that it would all turn out to concern nothing more alarming than hosiery contracts. But experience had taught him to suspect otherwise. The town seldom produced excitement without also producing scandal. In the silence of Northgate Street, he turned once upon his pillow and murmured, almost to himself, "Safe bridges, we shall see." Monday morning brought little relief from the town's growing excitement. Flaxborough had already begun to speculate upon conspiracies, Scottish intrigue, corporate espionage, or, most colourfully, a clandestine romance. Inspector Pubright, however, remained unimpressed by gossip and concentrated instead on small signs, odd remarks, and irregular behaviour. He decided it was time to conduct what he termed in his notes a test. Not one that would involve traps or confrontations. Pubright never hurried the human spirit, but rather a polite, carefully staged meeting intended to observe reactions without forcing confession. The first step was a second call upon Mr. McClintock. The hosiery traveller, at breakfast in the Royal, looked every inch the man whose shoes had trodden many towns, yet whose eyes betrayed unease when Pubright mentioned the missing postcard. "Do you happen to recall, Mr. McClintock," Pubright asked quietly, "if anything fell from your hand while in room 17? Perhaps the postcard, or another note?" McClintock blinked rapidly. Well, Inspector, it may have slipped. I hardly noticed. It was a minor thing, nothing of importance." "Indeed," Pubright murmured, inclining his head, making no further comment. Yet he allowed his gaze to linger upon the man's hands, noticing the faint smudge of ink on one finger, a trace of haste. Pubright then invited him to accompany the inspector on a walk through the town. "The air is fresh, the rain has eased, and I find conversation more revealing on the move," he explained. As they passed the cobbled market square, Pubright spoke of inconsequential matters: the misplacement of a flower pot, the clerk who could never remember his own lunch, the perils of thin rain on a poorly swept pavement. McClintock, in turn, revealed a nervous precision. He adjusted his collar constantly, counted his steps, and avoided eye contact whenever the subject of correspondence arose. Pubright said nothing, but stored each reaction carefully. Later, at the station, he recreated a minor scene from the Royal Hotel. A room with a desk, a half-written postcard, and a small, unsealed envelope. He placed them conspicuously on the table, as though left unattended. Then he asked casually, "Mr. McClintock, would you mind showing me how you normally handle correspondence?" The visitor's reaction was immediate, but subtle. He reached for the envelope, paused, then withdrew his hand abruptly. His voice hardened slightly. "I leave nothing of importance lying about. I do not understand the necessity of this demonstration." Pubright nodded, offering no reply. The purpose of the test was not to provoke explanation, but to observe unease. And observe he did. By evening, he called in Constable Love for a review. "You will note, Love, that no force has been applied, no question asked that might seem threatening. Yet observe the change in manner, hesitation, withdrawal, smudged ink, minor details, but telling." Love scratched his head. "So he's guilty?" Pubright smiled faintly. "Not guilty of everything, perhaps, but certainly aware of what is missing, and aware that someone else might know." He returned to his own office late that night, poured tea, and reviewed the events. 2 men, Scottish accents, postcards northward, sudden departures, and the faint smell of foreign tobacco, each element a note in a quiet chord of evidence. The test had been successful, nothing had been forced, nothing admitted, yet the guilty party had revealed himself, or at least revealed knowledge beyond casual awareness. Pubright wrote in his notebook, "Observation greater than interrogation. Ink smudge confirms presence. Reaction to staged display indicates knowledge. Next step, connect JR to postcard outside." Flaxborough slept, unaware that the threads it had spun into gossip were now being gathered carefully into the web of a quiet, civilized revelation. Pubright allowed himself the faintest satisfaction. The town might demand spectacle, he required only patience, a good eye, and the human habit of betraying truth when unwittingly prompted. By Tuesday morning, the town of Flaxborough had reached its limit of speculation. Shopkeepers argued over the details of the Royal Hotel incidents, the clergy remarked upon the moral implications of missing postcards and vanished guests, and Councillor Allgood fretted over the potential scandal to the borough's reputation. None, however, possessed the patient clarity of Inspector Pubright. He began the day with a polite summons to the Royal Hotel, where Mr. McClintock awaited, having been invited to tea in the lounge. The room was quiet, the hum of the rain softened against the glass panes. Pubright seated himself, poured a cup, and gestured for McClintock to do the same. "Thank you, Inspector," McClintock said, still slightly fidgeting. "I gather this is about the incidents in 17 and 19? "Precisely," Pubright replied, his tone neutral. "I believe the time has come to discuss what truly occurred." He laid the postcard and the envelope upon the table. Room 17, as you know, was entered, and yet nothing of substantial value removed. Only this, your half-written postcard, was disturbed. The envelope in room 19 contained a brief message, signed J.R. to someone northwards. McClintock leaned forward. Yes, but what do you mean?" Pubright regarded him quietly. "I mean only what is plainly evident. Both notes were meant for the same person. J.R., James Robertson, as recorded, was in fact a correspondent, not a victim. He came to Flaxborough to retrieve the message you had inadvertently left exposed. He did not take your property because it was never of interest to him. He took only the communication." McClintock's brows knitted. "So you mean that he removed nothing but the note?" Pubright allowed a pause, letting the calm clarity of his words settle. "And the bridge mentioned in his message was not a literal bridge, but a reference point, a meeting arranged discreetly. He ensured it was safe, as instructed by you, Mr. McClintock. The rest, the perceived intrusion, the missing postcards, the alarms, is a product of coincidence, misunderstanding, and the natural eagerness of small-town gossip." McClintock blinked, then exhaled audibly. "So, no burglar? No spy?" "Exactly," Pubright said gently. "No malevolence, only human caution and a misjudged assumption. You, sir, were observed, misinterpreted. The townsfolk have spun themselves into intrigue because the facts were too subtle to capture their imaginations." He tapped the postcard. "Observe. A small matter, trivial even, yet it has commanded the attention of an entire town. And observe also the lesson, behavioral clues, reaction to questions, hesitation, minor smudges, speak more than loud accusations ever could." McClintock, slowly comprehending, allowed a faint smile. "I suppose I owe you thanks, Inspector, for explaining it." Pubright inclined his head with his characteristic mildness. "You need no thanks. You acted with discretion. The message reached its destination. The town's excitement, while unfortunate, has caused no real harm." As he departed the Royal Hotel, Pubright allowed himself the smallest satisfaction in the neat, civil resolution. No scandal lingered beyond the gossip of an evening. No crime had been committed. The threads he had observed, postcards, messages, reactions, had aligned themselves quietly, and Flaxborough could resume its habitual calm, unaware that a minor mystery had been so meticulously unravelled. By the time he returned to his office, the town had already begun to forget the earlier urgency. The market square bustled with midweek. Business, shopkeepers exchanged pleasantries, and even Councillor Allgood's moustache had returned to its ordinary calm. Pubright settled at his desk, noting only 2 visitors, 1 misunderstanding, no loss. The trivial matter confirms the human tendency toward exaggeration. Observation, patience, civility, always sufficient. For the town, life would continue as usual. For Pubright, quiet satisfaction accompanied the mild thrill of another mystery resolved without drama or unnecessary alarm. By midweek, Flaxborough had settled back into its habitual rhythm. The cobbled streets glimmered after rain, shop windows reflected polite civility, and the occasional gossip passed along the market square had returned to the comfortable, inconsequential topics of fruit quality and the mismanagement of parish clocks. The Royal Hotel continued its regular service, though the broken door of room 17 had been repaired with admirable efficiency by Mr. Leaper, who insisted it was as good as new and better than some of our guests' manners. Chambermaids moved with quiet diligence, arranging towels and dusting vases as though nothing unusual had ever occurred. Inspector Pubright returned to his office at the police station, walking past the familiar faces of constables who had long since learned to admire his patience and understated wit. He placed the envelope and the postcard in the evidence drawer, not because they contained scandal or threat, but because they were small monuments to human curiosity and the delicacy of observation. Constable Love entered with the morning tea, eyes wide with the remnants of excitement. "Inspector, does this mean—" "Yes, Love," Pubright said gently, pouring a cup. "It means that a minor disturbance, misinterpreted, can create a great deal of noise. But if observed calmly and patiently, the truth often proves far less dramatic than speculation." The town itself seemed to echo this lesson in its return to routine. Mr. Hopgood continued to propound improbable theories over his pint, while Mr. Cattermole still hinted at romantic misadventures that had never occurred. Councillor Allgood resumed council duties with appropriate indignation over trivial civic matters, none of which involved postcards or bridges. Yet beneath the calm, the subtle change remained. People who had been touched by the events of the previous week walked a little more cautiously, looked a little more closely, and perhaps spoke a little more politely. Even Flaxborough's pigeons seemed to flutter with slightly more awareness. Pubright, seated at his desk, with the lamp casting a narrow pool of light, reviewed his notes once more. 2 Scottish travellers, a half-written postcard, an envelope marked J.R., and a brief disappearance. All had resolved without incident. Behavioural cues, attention to trivial details, and gentle questioning had revealed what others had missed in their eagerness for scandal. He poured himself the last of the tea, sipped slowly, and reflected on the simple elegance of a quietly solved puzzle. The town had not been scandalized, nor had justice required dramatic action. In Flaxborough, as always, civility endured, and small mysteries resolved themselves if met with patience and observation. With his papers filed neatly and his mind at ease, Pubright allowed himself a brief smile. There would always be another curious event, another minor disruption to the routines of the town. But for now, all was in order. He leaned back, folded his hands, and returned to the quiet satisfaction of completed work. Outside, Flaxborough moved on as it always did, unaware of how narrowly it had escaped intrigue and how quietly the truth had been preserved.